Ipsos Küresel Davranış Bilimleri Başkanı ve Humanizing Big Data kitabının yazarı Sayın Colin Strong'dan alacağız.
Merhaba. Good to be here in your beautiful city. Thank you for hosting us and giving us time today. So, Ipsos has been making a huge investment in science and technology. And I think that really fits with the theme of the conference about resilience, because clearly, if we're going to be resilient, if we're going to help our clients and brands and governments to be resilient, clearly we need the help of science and we need the help of technology. But when it comes to science and technology with regards to humans and understanding humans and perhaps, you know, working with and trying to sort of meet a brand's objectives as well as human objectives, things get a bit more complex. And that's really what I want to talk about today. We've got a particular theme where we're seeking out the non-conscious. And let me sort of just take you through how we're going to approach this particular challenge. Because I lead behavioral science at Ipsos, and many of the themes in the book, which many of you have got, will be picked up as we go through this. But I think one of the interesting challenges and opportunities with behavioral science, you know, the science of behavior, the science of humans, is that we have a fundamental question that many people ask: what is it? You know, what is this thing which there's a lots of sort of interest and excitement and feeling like you're perhaps almost hype about at times? You know, what is it and how do we define it? Because I think different organizations, different people have different takes on it. And I want to talk to you about our take on it here at Ipsos. There is a measurement issue as well, because if we're talking about non-conscious, if we're talking about causes of behavior rather than reasons for behavior, then I think there are measurement implications. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about those measurement implications. And then perhaps, given I'm probably here with a room full of many of you who are practitioners, including myself, what do we do with it? And I just want to sort of just talk you through some of the work which we've done and the ways in which we've used it and applied it. So, here we go. What is it? Well, I think it's kind of impossible to do a presentation on behavioral science without referencing this book, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he popularized this notion, and I'm going to apologize in advance to many of you who are very familiar with this. I'm going to give you a few examples, and many of you will be aware of them in advance. But I think it's worth just sort of thinking about it and talking about it a little bit. And then I'm going to do a but, okay? So just to warn you in advance. So this notion that we have two systems has been around since the birth of psychology, and you know it's a fairly straightforward one in the sense that we've got a system one, which is where we make snappy decisions really fast. It operates on a kind of non-conscious level, so we've got these little mental algorithms going on in the back of our head, because if we didn't, then there's just too much for us to absorb over the course of a day. You know, we'd be sort of static, trying to sort of process all that information, trying to make a more, what might be considered a system 2 decision, which is a bit more slow, conscious, and effortful. Okay, so this sort of, this popularization of System 1 and System 2 by Kahneman has spawned a whole industry and has spawned a whole sort of debate and conversation, and it's been great for that. And I just want to take you through a few examples of the way in which it's been popularized and used. Now, I'm going to show you a clip from a film, and the film is, I think, called Fusion, and it's just to, this may be a bit heavy going for the simultaneous translator. So just to let you know, this is an example of priming. So there's a number 55 which is shown throughout it. Again, some of you may have seen this, but I think it's a very nice, straightforward, popular example of the way in which information in the environment might cause certain behavior without us necessarily being aware of it.
How did you do that?
Lee Wan Say, legendary gambler. He bets on everything, anything, huge cash bets all the time. Wants to Bellagio put Bill Gates out of the high roller suite because Leo was flying in. He is the perfect Vic.
How did you know who he was gonna pick?
He told him to. I've been telling him all day. From the moment he left his hotel room, we've been priming him, programming his subconscious. He's been seeing the number 55 all day long. On the elevator, in the lobby, even the stick pin on the doormat. Not only that, we loaded his route from the hotel to the stadium. He looks out the window, primers are everywhere. Now he doesn't see it, but he does. There's no getting around it. He even sees far. Suggestions are everywhere, from the number of flowers in the vase.
That is genius.
Yeah, and it's not only what he sees, it's what he hears. The Mandarin word for 5 is wu. There are 124 woo-woos in sympathy for the devil. Now he's not registering it, but it's all there. So when he picks up those binoculars, looks out on the field, sees a familiar face with the number 55 on his jersey, some little voice in the back of his mind says, that's it. And he thinks it's intuition, and he picks.
Okay, so there you go, a sort of popular example in film of the way of priming, and you can see that. So I just think it's a nice illustration of the way this works. Now, does that really convert into our conversations about consumers? Well, look, here's a couple of examples. You know, this is a fairly well-known one about the sort of choice of printer shredders. Very sort of a much less sort of glamorous topic, I guess. And so people, you know, when people are given this choice, well, you're going to buy the $20 one which does 7 sheets, or the $50 one to 11 sheets. Kind of seems sensible to go to the $20 one, and that's indeed what most people do. But what happens if you add a more expensive one in at $95? Well, that seems, why, you know, in a sense, why would you buy that one? You know, because it only does an extra 1 sheet at a time, and it's an awful lot more money. But as many of you will be, familiar with, I'm kind of guessing, it has the effect of moving people up. So then people are then deciding, actually, we've got this bias towards a middle option, and then we're more likely to buy the more expensive option, the $50 one, rather than the $20 one. And this is a tool which is used by market traders, by retailers, by online merchants, and so on. You know, this is a phenomenon that is, not new, but it's the new thing about it is the fact we are starting to understand it and document it. Another example, before we move on, there's a very famous Wheel of Fortune study by Kahneman, and he did this a 2-part study. First of all, he said, what percentage of African countries are members of the United Nations? Now, if you're from the region or if you work in policy, you may know, but unlikely, and I don't know, I sense that most people in this room wouldn't know. Okay, so, I'll pose this question to you, and then we'll come back to it. Then, let's just say, for example, we'll divide the room into two somehow, and I'll have an imaginary Wheel of Fortune up here, and this is what he actually had a Wheel of Fortune. And let's say this side of the room, on this Wheel of Fortune, it's just a wheel that spins, and it randomly, apparently, settled on the number 10. Okay, so this is a memory test. We're going to come back to this, was the instruction. This side of the room, again, same thing, but this time the Wheel of Fortune landed on number 65. So, fine, we'll come back to that. Now, I'll come back to the original question about what percentage of African countries are members of the United Nations. Now you can answer it, not really, but this is what's in the experiment. They said, this side of the room said 25%. Okay, seems as good a number as any, why wouldn't it be? Now, you'd expect this side of the room to also answer 25%, surely, all things being equal, but, ta-da, no, it's 45%, because essentially this is an anchoring thing. We use information in the environment to help us make decisions, and this has been shown time and again. If you ask people to get credit cards out and write down the last 2 digits of the credit card and then value a bottle of wine, that is the valuation of the bottle of wine is a function of the numbers which they picked up at random. And so you can see in a very straightforward way, the way in which retailers may then create certain anchors in the environment by way of category, by way of the kind of symbolism in the shop, for example, to be able to anchor things to higher prices. Now, so there's a couple of examples of the way in which perhaps non-conscious operates, in that we have these kind of these information in the environment which is shaping our behavior in ways which we are not necessarily conscious of. And this is where the buts start coming in. We have a slightly more subtle story. There's an academic we work with at Queen Mary College London called Magda Osman, and she sort of does a lot of work in the area of agency and intentionality. And she makes the point, look, we're not simply automata carrying out plans of action to external stimuli. That's not how you felt this morning coming here. You decided what you're going to eat for breakfast, you decided how you're going to get here, etc. So our agency, our conscious intentionality also shapes our behavior. Of course it does. And it almost seems silly pointing that out, but I feel sometimes in the excitement of the non-conscious, it can be easy to forget that actually a lot of the time our behavior is driven by what we think and how we feel and what we intend to do. Now, just to give you another sort of example of the way in which conscious processing influences our behavior, there's an experiment with monkeys, and it's done in a very ethical way, I just wanted to point out. And it's about the way in which we all act based on fairness and our perceptions of fairness. And we can have a very conscious, very clear understanding of what's something that's fair or not fair. And I think this is a very vivid example of just how powerful that is.
The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
I really like that clip. It makes me, I'm borrowing jokes from other people, you know, so I'm no good at them myself. So I think that's a really good example of the power of just, look, this is our conscious lives, and if we see things consciously, it really makes us act in a very powerful way. So, you know, the point being that we need to be able to integrate both of those different aspects into what we do. There's many of you will be able to sort of see what these, we'll be able to anticipate what this graph is. And this graph is that of organ donation. And what determines where it's low is where you've got to, where the default is that, well, you have to opt in, essentially, rather than opt out. So where you have to opt out in the, with the blue bars, then clearly organ donation is high. But to go back to Magda Osman again, she makes the point that that creates problems, because actually in situations where you've got to opt out, where there's a default to opt out, otherwise your organs get donated, there is a lot of issues of families saying, hang on, I'm going to veto this because actually the meaning and the intention of this person who has died is not to donate their organs. So the point being that we really need to be able to take into account both of those things, the unconscious kind of nudging, but also the conscious intentionality and agency. And that's really where we need to have a more subtle and more nuanced and more thoughtful approach for integrating science and causality with market research. They both have a role. They both work together. But what we need to be is smart in terms of when it's unconscious, when it's conscious, and how do we integrate that. And whilst the whole discipline of behavioral science has been around for a long time, and I was studying when I was at university, and that's quite a long time ago, then the practice, the application in commercial and public sector fields is still relatively new. And so therefore, there's a lot of ground which we really need to cover in terms of answering these sorts of questions. Okay, I want to turn now to a little bit of a conversation about measurement, because clearly if we're asking people about things, about their reasons for doing things, as we do in market research, as we do in surveys, as we do in focus groups and so on, if we, that's relatively straightforward in terms of measurement. We ask them. We have very sophisticated ways of asking them, but we're asking them to, we're trying to elicit their responses to things. Yeah, very familiar. But clearly, if we're looking at causality, of which we're not necessarily conscious, then it becomes a little bit more difficult. It becomes a little bit more complex. We can't necessarily ask people. We don't ask people, how much impact did this advertising have on your decision? Maybe we probably shouldn't do, because we don't really know. And we have all sorts of sophisticated ways of getting around that, clearly. So, but with a focus really on behavioral science, I want to talk about the need to really move to and complement the market research techniques with more experimental designs. Because really, to understand causes, we can't rely on correlations. There's a great example, illustration of this, which I'd suggest just, if you want a bit of amusement, just have a look at Tyler Viglin's site called Spurious Correlations. And he collected data about from the US over from a number of years, and just things like, well, per capita cheese consumption with number of people who died getting tangled in their bed sheets. Yes, both those information sources existed. And yes, they correlate beautifully. Now, clearly they correlate, but as we all know, as a bunch of very smart, good practitioners, correlation does not equal causation. Similarly, number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates very highly with films that Nicolas Cage has starred in. Now, there are many, many, many of those which you can sort of while away lunchtime in the office and have a chuckle about. But the point being, this is spurious, and we need to be careful not to identify causation in that kind of spurious way. It's very easy to think, oh, we've done this effect, and we can see, we've done this sort of intervention, we can see this effect, must be it. But we need to be more careful about the way in which we do that. There's a famous study by Richard Thaler about at a canteen, I think it's the canteen at the university where he works, and they decided to see if they could nudge people into eating more fruit rather than cake, because of course, better outcomes for people to eat fruit rather than cake. So they did a very simple nudge of of availability and making it easy for people. So they moved the fruit to the front and moved the cake to the back. Simple, straightforward, very worked. More people ate fruit. Success. Great. Now, in Holland, a few years later, an erstwhile psychologist decided to try the same thing in her local supermarket and had some white bread and some brown bread. Clearly, brown wholemeal bread is better for you, but a lot of people prefer white bread. But anyway, same issue with the cake and with the dessert. Moved it around, moved the brown bread to the front, moved the white bread to the back. Same effect? No. Didn't work. Nah, diddly squat. No difference whatsoever. People just reached over and got their favorite white bread. So the point is, we really need to make sure that we don't just assume that the same effect will always be the case in different contexts. That's why we need to test. That's why we need experimental design. And we also need to say, look, how much does this influence behavior? If it influences behavior a little bit, but you've spent a huge amount on it, not great. We did a study looking at the impact of safety labels on people's storage behavior. So, trying different safety labels, and did they actually impact where people stored them? We did a little experimental design. We got shoppers with kids, so we picked them out of the. They were very obliging because they had handfuls of shopping and young children. But so we took them into a room and said, now put away this shopping, which we gave them. And we had sort of different groups with different safety labels. And we then could observe how their behavior in terms of where they put them on a shelf changed as a function of the different types of safety label. So if they put them high up with other more dangerous things, then it kind of worked. If they put them low down with less dangerous things, then they didn't work so well. So we were able to then say, actually, we've got a behavioral outcome here. We can assess and measure very clearly how much this actually impacted on behavior. So applying behavioral science, I think that the challenge of this is that, people like me come along and we have a nice kind of lunchtime session and we sort of show these kind of what I call the magic tricks, the kind of the conjurer things, as we saw earlier on. Oh, here's an interesting thing. You thought this, but actually it's that. And I think we need to just move it on a little bit to say, well, look, how do we actually use this and apply this to help with some of our challenges? So let me just talk you through just a few things which we're doing at the moment. And I think before we get into that, I think one of the big questions which you often get is, look, when do we use it? What is a behavioral science? When is a behavioral science needed? And the opportunity and challenge is that, well, there aren't any absolutes with this, but we tend to say, look, often issues can't necessarily be resolved always by asking people their reasons, because their reasons may give you some of the understanding of the issue and give you an indication of what to do, but not always. But a lot of the time, it's good enough. A lot of the time, it's actually what we absolutely need. But if we want to change behavior, then behavioral science is very helpful. And also, if we suspect it's actually information in the environment which is shaping behavior. If it's being shaped tacitly, then that is also helpful. So just, if you're thinking about projects and where it might be useful, I think those are kind of fairly useful guidance. The way in which we approach a behavioral science project is relatively straightforward. I have a mantra that if it's rocket science, it's not going to take off. And essentially what we really need to be doing is to say, look, where there's a challenge, how do we then talk about that challenge in behavioral terms? One of the challenges might be we want people to get fit, we want people to buy more pet food, or whatever it might be. The point is that that's not stated in a behavioral term. When, how, where, do we want this to happen? We want to understand the specific behaviors we're trying to influence and really be able to sort of spell those out. Then we do a phase of identifying the barriers to those behaviors, and often our clients have this information. often there's huge amounts of research being done, but it's just a matter of looking at it with a new lens. Then we move on to identifying the interventions, and then we identify ways of, well, then let's test the impact of those interventions and see how we can improve things. We do this in a few different areas. We do quite a bit of work in the area of customer journeys. We recently had a talk by one of our clients who was talking about the way in their store they use peak end effect to design their customer journeys. And so they will have a sort of peak end effect is where our recall of the experience and our sort of satisfaction with the experience is disproportionately influenced by the peaks. You know, if you have a peak experience, say you're on holiday and you have some fabulous thing in the middle of it, that will disproportionately influence your perception of it, and also just make sure the ending's good. You know, great ending. So you know, we can use that sort of understanding and that kind of insight in order to help design customer journeys in a way which help go with the grain of consumer behavior. Because we've got to design them some way, so we need to design them in a way which perhaps facilitates things rather than necessarily hinders things. We do a lot of work in terms of optimizing comms materials, whether it's in-store execution or whether it's packaging. We recently been doing work looking at optimizing letters for a road safety agency. We've got new smart motorways in the UK, which nobody really understands, and people keep driving where they shouldn't. And so how can we design letters in a way that's going to make people change their behavior most effectively? So always what we do in these situations is then review the materials using the academic literature, but then ideally what we need to then do is to say, look, this is what best practice says from the academic literature in terms of changing behavior, but we really need to be testing that and doing some experimental type work. We do a lot of work in the area of digital, and just to sort of bring this back to the book, because digital is clearly having a huge impact, and it is perhaps one of the, because without saying it, is the biggest challenge, but I think that we face to understand and be able to work with, but it is fundamentally changing the consumer decision architecture. There's a great book by Shlomo Benartzi where he talks about this, and I recommend getting that in actual fact, but he makes the point that the online world is so visual, is so immersive, then perhaps we become more susceptible, we're more driven by those external cues rather than our a priori needs, desires, wants, which we can perhaps articulate. So we're more driven by these kind of causal, contextual information. And we talk about this quite a bit in some of the, in the book and in some of the other things we work on. And we've also just explore the way in which this is changing the decision architecture. Please do go onto our website to sort of download the sort of white paper on this. But it's the expectations are fundamentally being shifted. The way, not the psychology of this is fundamentally changing. What we need to bring to the party to understand it has shifted. There's an expectations around personalization, around moment optimization. There's issues around disfluency. Do we always want things to be easy, or do we sometimes need things to be a little bit more disfluent? So we use this kind of information. We've been exploring this with a broadcaster who wanted to optimize their digital channels. So how can they optimize these in a way to be as human as possible? So we then sort of say, look, what is a human experience? Let's use behavioral science to be able to identify what a human experience is. And we've got a model of 5 H's: head, heart, head, hands, herd, hero, and use that to start defining what a positive experience is from a behavioral science perspective, and then use the behavioral science to help us guide the design in order to get there. But I think there's an overarching point that before we can change behavior, we need to understand both conscious and unconscious mechanisms. Because a lot of behavior is quite complex. And complex behavior isn't necessarily always just going to be easy to nudge in the way in which we saw earlier. There's lots of layers. So, for example, with pollution protection, there's all sorts of beliefs about pollution and how you protect yourself, and values and cultural norms that are important to take into consideration. Vaccination operates in a very similar way, and we therefore bring in the whole, well, what's a psychology of health protection, and how do people sort of take that into account? The whole issue of transportation and encouraging people to use transport. All of these are complex behavior with many different roots to them. So we need to use models and frameworks that help us bring that together, to integrate them, have a much more holistic approach. Yes, we need the science and the causality, but we also need to understand the reasons that people are giving as well, in terms of their capabilities, the opportunity they have to do things, their motivations to do things. It's all about bringing those different aspects together, and then really making sure we understand the underlying psychology in terms of these key issues like health protection, well-being, trust. All of these are shaping our behavior, and we really need to bring the behavioral science of these to the party if we're going to help change behavior. I'm not going to talk about our lab. We have lots of R&D activity going on, but I just want to just finish off by saying, look, there's 3 key points to finish on here. First, and this is our manifesto for really a new behavioral science, which is properly integrated and properly considered and powerful, is of course we need to use the non-conscious and understand that, but we need to go beyond that. We really need to make sure that we're using the psychology of our conscious as well as our non-conscious lives. We need to make sure that we do science by using experiments, and we integrate them with more familiar market research methods. It's not an either-or. We need to bring both of those things together. And finally, we need to start and we need to finish with the business or the policy challenge. That's the key thing which determines how we then approach it, whether it's behavioral science, whether it's market research, whether it's a combination of the two. That's the focus. Let's not let the tail wag the dog, as we say in the UK. Thank you very much.